For something that unfolded in plain sight, I am somewhat amazed that almost nobody's talking about why the meltdown in the Oval Office really happened and what it signified. So let's see if we can unpick that now. I know I said days ago I thought Trump would try to humiliate Zelensky at the White House. At that time, at least, I thought that would be the sideshow to signing the deal, not the only thing that ended up happening. But in retrospect, we should have rated this sort of outcome much higher than anyone would have thought to do. Let's put it this way. We've just had two European leaders parading through the Oval Office earlier in the week. Macron and Starmer. They had done their best to charm Trump, to flatter him, to feed his narcissism in the hope that he wouldn't bite them. And in that they largely succeeded. They also tried to sway him back from the might makes right worldview, whereby all evidence of the US-Russia summit in Riyadh, as well as additional things that he said since, he is conspiring with Vladimir Putin to bring the Ukraine war to a rapid but uneven close. And in that, they completely failed. But because they managed the first part, they were able to leave with the delusion and the conceit that maybe the world hadn't fundamentally changed, maybe it was still really the same world as before, business as usual. We just needed to flatter Trump a bit more, play a bit more to his vanity, tell him how strong he'll look if he stands up to Putin, and then he'll come round. People have noted that Zelensky was not on such charming top form in this meeting, and therefore some hold that, therefore, how it all went wrong was his failing. But this is missing the context. Zelensky's country dies with the old world order. Unlike Macron and Starmer, he can't pretend. There's no place for him to hide. This was arguably his last chance. Remember what came out of that Riyadh US-Russia summit that I discussed here at the time? That the US and Russia were floating a three-stage so-called peace plan purely on Russia's terms. Stage 1, ceasefire. Stage 2, Zelensky's push to hold an election, since active hostilities have ceased, and Russia can aim to have a Putin puppet emerge from that process, but if that's not possible, they still get someone newly in position, more likely to be able to be bested and manipulated. Stage 3, then real talks on the final peace deal begin. As should be obvious to anyone, a coordinated trap for Ukraine to get the best possible deal for Putin. Think about that. The US is acting as an adversary at that point, even if it's not ideologically committed to the stance. Against that, we have this critical minerals deal. Zelensky had hoped that the deal would be the thing that appeals to Trump sufficiently to divert course from that previous track, that Trump's ego and self-interest might mean that his initial inclinations would be lined up behind Ukraine's best interests instead. But the Trump administration had steadfastly refused to permit the insertion of any security guarantees into the deal. It stated that merely having American businesses present in Ukraine doing business, that would dissuade Putin from invading. There were, of course, plenty of American businesses active in Ukraine in 2022, which made zero difference whatsoever. In the meantime, Trump has been talking up an early ceasefire, and we've also seen attacks from his close associates on Zelensky's legitimacy as his country's president. So Zelensky came to this meeting not just to sign a deal that, as things were progressing, was clearly crafted in a way that would make no difference whatsoever to the outcome of the war, but he also felt he had one last chance to push back against this pincer movement, to put the case why an immediate ceasefire wouldn't work because Putin can't be trusted. Most people have only watched the discussion after it went off the rails, which gives one impression of how it all went. Some have watched the full 40 minutes and identified a different moment where it started to go wrong, having seemed to have been previously on course for the signing to happen as planned. But this conflict, this tension, was marked from the beginning. The very open of the press meeting, Trump started talking about how he'd spoken with Putin and they were going to try and bring it all to a close. The big thing was to stop the killing straight away. In other words, the ceasefire line. Then he hands over to Zelensky to make some remarks, and Zelensky could have stuck to flattery and platitudes, but his back was to the wall, so he talked about needing to count on Trump's strong position to stop Putin, who he said was a killer and a terrorist. They needed to save his country, but also to stand for their shared values of freedom. There should be no compromises with a killer, he said. He talked about how the Russians had stolen tens of thousands of Ukrainian children. They need to bring those back. He showed Trump and the media before and after photos showing how Ukrainian prisoners of war were being mistreated by the Russians, starved and beaten. This was what primed the ticking time bomb that went off later in the meeting, with J.D. Vance particularly complaining about him coming to the White House to make this sort of case. But what choice did he have, really? He didn't have the luxury afforded to Starmer and Macron of being able to pretend that he could flatter Trump and sign a deal that meant nothing except a transfer of wealth to the United States, and then being asked to say thank you for Trump's team selling him out to Putin. Arguably, it was better to prosecute his case in front of a watching media and let the responses make the situation clear to the world. Macron and Starmer's so-called triumphs have been shown up by the harsh reality of how that played out. Now that's the analytical, impersonal review. You can't help some degree of other reactions to come out of the specifics. For example, J.D. Vance demanding that Zelensky should say thank you to them.
Have you said thank you once this entire meeting? No, in this entire meeting, have you said thank you?
They'd come here to sign a deal, but the tone of voice made it clear that he at least saw Zelensky as a supplicant. And this wasn't just an in the heat of a moment line. The White House then tweeted this after the event. Now, Zelensky has, of course, thanked America and its leaders many times over and over again. But what specifically does J.D. Vance think Zelensky should be thanking him and Donald Trump for? They have told Zelensky he needs to give up territory to Russia, in Trump's words, because many Russians died to get that territory. They have said that it is out of the question for Ukraine to join NATO. They have said that America will not participate in any peacekeeping force or even support European forces with services. They repeated Putin's attack line about how Zelensky should have new presidential elections before negotiations starts. They've met with Russia with no preconditions, without inviting Ukraine to the table, following Putin's talking lines. They talked about dropping sanctions against Russia, inviting them back to the G7, and they voted against Ukraine's motion to the United Nations, condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine, alongside Russia and North Korea. Heck, new appointees to the administration make themselves look stupid on the way in by refusing to say that Russia invaded Ukraine in the first place.
Can you tell me if Russia invaded Ukraine? Mr. Feinberg? I mean, Mr. Hexet said it.
Yeah, I understand.
It's easy, yes or no. Did they invade Ukraine?
I don't feel that I should publicly comment in the middle of a tense negotiation when I'm not privy to the facts to undermine what potentially...
You're not privy to the fact whether or not Russia invaded Ukraine and started a war that's lasted for 3 years?
Also, J.D. Vance went on record a couple of years ago saying then what he clearly still feels, that he couldn't care less what happens to Ukraine. So, what is Zelensky supposed to be thanking you for again? People who have been saying that Zelensky messed up because he was too confrontational, too brittle, and this set Donald and JD off, they're assuming that the highest objective of the summit was to avoid upsetting the deeply fragile egos in the room long enough to sign a completely worthless deal. I mean, worthless in terms of peace, obviously not in terms of dollars for America. Zelensky had two possible good outcomes, one of them a lot better than the other. The much better outcome would have been to actually persuade the administration, or maybe enough of a watching public to influence the administration down the road, that Putin's plan should not be entertained. It was a long shot, but it's what he started off apparently aiming for. The second, barely good but maybe necessary outcome was that in the failure of the first objective, it becomes starkly clear to the world that Trump is 100% behind Putin and they should stop kidding themselves that the US is anything other than an adversary of Ukraine. For what it's worth, that's what was achieved. Of course, the deeply partisans took from the episode whatever version they decided fitted their priors the best. Suddenly, MAGA Republicans are talking about how essential it was that Zelensky should have been wearing a suit. Utterly irrelevant, and of course they wouldn't have cared in other circumstances. Just ask Elon Musk. The question now is, so what? Zelensky has arrived in Britain ahead of a meeting with European leaders tomorrow. He's in a meeting with Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, today. Starmer is currently entertaining the conceit that he can act as a bridge between Ukraine and the Trump administration. This is self-aggrandizing delusion. Just because the dog didn't bite him on Thursday doesn't mean it's going to do tricks for him. Most of the commentators, and indeed the politicians, are reading this wrong. Because A, they want to believe that if they can pretend the old rules still apply, it will somehow make it so. And B, they think that the minerals deal had something to do with actually increasing the strength of Ukraine in the face of Russia's war, which it didn't. So now they're thinking, how can we smooth this over and get that deal signed? The deal didn't happen because, as constituted, it doesn't stop the US doing what it is already organising to do, selling Ukraine to Putin at the earliest opportunity. Until you get that, you don't have a hope of coming up with a response that meets the situation, and so you will continually be getting caught out as things continue to unravel from here in ways that were utterly predictable but that you failed to notice. For instance, I ask again, what is NATO now? Do we really think the US is committed to step in on behalf of any NATO member in the future? On what do we base that assessment? Trump did an interview after the blowout where he basically made it clear that his real problem with Zelensky is that he keeps saying nasty things about Putin.
Putin this, Putin that, and all negative things. He's got to say, I want to make peace.
And therefore he would rather fight on than make peace. Like I said, that was the dynamic right from the start of the meeting. Trump says, you can trust my friend Putin, so we should have an immediate ceasefire. And if you don't do that, that makes you the warmonger who wants to keep fighting. Zelensky did not have the option of buying into that fantasy world. The fantasy world where Trump says, without this minerals deal, you have no cards and you will be finished very quickly. But if you sign this deal with, by the way, zero security guarantees, suddenly you will be in a powerful position. Now, maybe Trump actually believes that. His cabinet will back up whatever he says, because that's the price of admission, and none of them have a spine to speak of between the lot of them. But Zelensky has no choice but to reevaluate his options now that he faces Putin, supported by a hostile United States. That didn't change yesterday. That was already the situation. It's just now viscerally visible for those that are receptive to the evidence of their senses.